Hello and welcome, everybody. It's really good to have you here with us today. I'm Kim Goff-Crews. I am the Secretary and Vice President for University Life here at Yale. And I'm the University Officer who leads Belonging at Yale, which is the university's activities, its actual initiative, which is designed to enhance diversity, support equity, and also promote a sense of well-being, a sense of inclusion and belonging and welcome for all of our community members. Now, today's conversation is one of a series of occasional conversations that we have sponsored by Belonging at Yale. Some of you know, I know, have been with us in our conversations with Dolly Chugg or with Ibram Kendi. Others of you might have joined the first My Story event that we had a couple of weeks ago, where we feature students, faculty, staff, and alumni to talk about their sense of belonging on campus. A really interesting event. So whether you've been with me before on some of these other events or this is your first time, a hearty welcome to you today. I do want to point out that the Belonging at Yale website features a lot of a calendar, which has a lot of these events and some of the taping of some of the events. So I ask you to check that out regularly as well. But today our conversation is going to be really interesting and very timely and on point. Respecting all Connecticut families, the legal parent-child relationship for unmarried, same-sex, and non-biological parents. This is a topic that's actually interesting for everybody, but I'm particularly glad to host this event this month in April when we celebrate LGBTQ Pride. In conversation today are two of our Yale community members, a faculty and staff member. Douglas NeJaime, who teaches at the Yale Law School, is with us. He is the Anne Urowsky Professor of Law, and he has a secondary appointment, by the way, at the Yale Child Study Center. Doug teaches courses on professional responsibility, family law, the constitution of the family, and also law and sexuality. But he is, for today's purposes, the principal drafter of the Connecticut Parentage Act. That act, for those of you who don't know, passed with near unanimous support, which is kind of hard to do nowadays, so really well done, Doug. Near unanimous support from Connecticut legislators, and it was signed into law by the governor in 2021. He is going to be in conversation with Deborah Stanley-McAulay, who is the Associate Vice President for Employee Engagement and Workplace Culture. Many of us know that Deb oversees the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, Work Life, and Child Care programs, and is also the key person responsible for New Haven Hiring Initiative. And she is also the chief liaison for all of our affinity groups. So with that, I know I'm looking forward to this conversation, as many of you are, and I'm going to turn it over to Debbie and Doug.
Welcome, everyone, and a particular welcome to you, Doug. Thanks for agreeing to be in conversation with me.
Thank you.
I also understand that you've agreed to be in conversation with all of our participants. So I want to remind all of our participants that there's an opportunity for them to contribute questions during this presentation and discussion using the question and answer function at the bottom of the screen. So Doug, during our time together, I've got questions, a host of questions that are going to fall into 5 different categories. The first is going to be a broad set of questions that ground us in this discussion. The second is I'm hoping to delve into the Connecticut Parentage Act. And then I thought we'd move over to maybe understanding how you were able to get the law passed. And then specifically about law and your scholarship. And then finally, I'd love to close us out with some guidance and some advice that you might have that we can implement long after today's discussion. So I hope that's the journey that you're on. It's the one that I'm hoping we're going to go on together.
Great.
So let me start, thank you. Let me start with really a broad question. Before we get into the Connecticut Parentage Act. Can you just tell us what parentage is? It's not a term that most of us use with any degree of regularity.
Yeah, so it's in some ways a term of art, but parentage simply refers to the legal parent-child relationship. And so our laws have up until this point generally used the terms paternity and maternity, but the gender-neutral term parentage is what our law is going to use now, simply to describe the status of being a legal parent or a child of a legal parent.
Okay, fantastic. And why is this important?
Yeah, so a lot comes from having a legal parent-child relationship. So there's a host of parental rights, but also responsibilities that come with parentage. So if you are a legal parent, you have decision-making authority to make decisions about where your child goes to school and what kind of healthcare your child gets. And you also, if you and the other person who might be the parent aren't living together, you have the ability to seek custody or visitation with your child. You also have an obligation to financially support your child, at least until they're 18. So it's not just rights, it's important responsibilities. And then a lot of other benefits turn on having a legal parent-child relationship, federal and state benefits, Social Security survivor benefits, access to things like health insurance for a child. And so having that legal status is really important to families.
Thank you. And I imagine that there are many of our participants that are probably taking their own notes, because as you and I engage in conversation, not only will I walk away with new knowledge, I'm hoping they will as well. So Doug, if we were to turn our attention specifically to the Connecticut Parentage Act, can you give us a brief summary of what it actually is?
Yeah, so I guess let me take off from what we were just talking about, which is for most people, they don't have to think twice about the fact that they're a legal parent of their child. And for those folks, this law doesn't really change much. But there are a lot of people in Connecticut and elsewhere who are raising their child, and yet the law might not treat them as a legal parent. And some people are aware of this and they try and do things to get around it. Other people might never know that they actually aren't legally recognized because everyone else is treating them like a parent. So what the Connecticut Parentage Act tries to do is ensure that all children in Connecticut have equal access to the security of that legal parent-child relationship by having a more comprehensive and inclusive parentage framework in our law, so that people who otherwise might be treated as legal strangers to their children will now be treated as legal parents to their children. So I can walk through a few of the ways in which that happens.
Very helpful, thank you.
So for same-sex couples, ordinarily you will have one of the parents not have a genetic connection to the child. And so if we have a legal framework that is designed around biology, which most legal frameworks around parent-child relationships are, that means for LGBTQ parents, half of them are going to not be treated as parents. And so we had cases in Connecticut where you had a same-sex couple who had a child together through donor insemination. So they used donor sperm and raised the kid together, and then they break up. Let's say the kid's 6 or 8 or 10. The non-biological mother had no ability to even get into court and say that she was a parent of the child and seek custody. And so the law now changes that. And so now it says, yes, biology is still a basis on which to establish parentage, but there's other bases as well. And I tend to talk about these as intent and function. So intent is, take that same-sex couple. They are having a child together with donor sperm. They both intend to be parents of the child. We should treat them both as parents of the child. If a heterosexual married couple had a child that way, our law was treating them both as parents. We should do the same thing for same-sex couples, and we should do the same thing for unmarried couples. The other dimension is what I call function, and that's recognizing someone as a parent because they're actually parenting a child. They've developed a parent-child relationship. So we had a wonderful family who testified in support of the act, and they were a married same-sex couple. And they had a child together with donor sperm, but one of the women also had a child from a previous different sex relationship. And that child was 3 when the mom got together with her partner, and the child was now 14 when the bill was up and he testified in support of the bill. And he had been being raised by these 2 moms, and he called them both mom, and his father wasn't really in the picture. And under our existing law, there was no way for him to get the security of a legal parent-child relationship with his non-biological mother. And intent wouldn't do him any good because she wasn't there when he was conceived. And so we have now in the law something called de facto parentage, which will take effect July 1. And that's essentially treating people as parents because they've developed a parent-child relationship and are actually parenting the child. So overall, the Act now provides routes to people for people to be treated as parents based on non-biological factors like intent and function, or marriage to the birth parent in a gender-neutral way.
Okay. Thank you, Doug. So Doug, clearly I'm a bit biased and believe that this was important, but overall, why was it important to have this act passed?
Yeah, so I mean, as I was saying, a lot of people didn't have a legal relationship, but a lot of people were actually remedying that by adopting their own children. So it was really powerful when the chief probate judge testified in support of the bill, because the probate court in Connecticut has jurisdiction over adoptions. Mm-hmm. And she came in and said, I apologize to these families when they come in to adopt their own kids. They shouldn't have to do this. And same-sex couples, if they're being advised, are told, do the adoption, there still, unfortunately, are going to be reasons to think about adoption as an option given hostility in other states. But I think we now have the tools in Connecticut to give people the security of parentage without having to go through the adoption process. And it's important because it also means that kids will have the security of having a legal parent-child relationship, so that they have the right to maintain relationships with their parents. And if one parent dies, they aren't then taken into state custody or given to a family member. They're able to stay with their parent. There's just been too many sort of heart-wrenching cases in which children's relationships with the people who are parenting them are not respected by our law. And it's important that our law actually respect families as they exist in our state.
Doug, you briefly mentioned other states. So I'm wondering if you could talk with us about the process prior to getting this act passed. In Connecticut, were we leading or lagging?
Yeah. So the act is modeled on a uniform act, the Uniform Parentage Act of 2017, which I was involved with, that is put out by the Uniform Law Commission, which is a nonpartisan group of law professors, state lawmakers, state court judges, and lawyers. And so that was representing sort of the new best practices model. And Washington State adopted a version of it. Maine, California, Rhode Island, and Vermont all adopted versions of it before we did, but not so bad to be, in the forefront of that. And our mission has been to especially try to make New England a real zone of equality here. And so a version of the bill is pending in Massachusetts right now, and it's being fiercely debated. And we are hopeful that the Massachusetts legislature will pass it. But what's especially important about Connecticut is that when you look at a state like California already had really good law. So it didn't take them much to get up to speed with this. Connecticut's laws had not been updated in decades. And so our laws still said husband and wife. Even once we allowed same-sex couples to marry, we didn't change our parentage laws. Mm-hmm. Our laws still talked about children, quote, born out of wedlock. I mean, terms that we don't use anymore. And so there were various ways in which our laws just hadn't kept up. We talked about artificial insemination, when assisted reproduction involves a lot of different procedures now. And so Connecticut badly needed this. And the most important thing was that Connecticut was the only state in New England that didn't have a path to parentage for a non-biological parent in an unmarried couple. And so that's people shouldn't have to get married in order for their parent-child relationships to be recognized. And that was a really important advance in our law, given how far we had lagged behind.
Yeah, thank you, Doug. So we sort of started with the end. I'd like to kind of go back and have you talk with us about the journey. Can you talk with us about the process of getting the law passed? What was the process? What was your role? What role did others play?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start by saying I had recently moved to Yale, and it was actually really kind of amazing to me the ways in which coming from the university allowed me to speak to a lot of folks who our decision makers in the state and talk to them about this issue. And I don't know, coming from California, that I had any similar opportunities there. So it was nice to be able to do that. So I was teaching a course called The Constitution of the Family in the law school, and started I invited the new chair from the Judiciary Committee to come speak to the class. I invited the head of the family law section of the bar. And then eventually we had the person that ended up being our chief legislative sponsor, Representative Jeff Curry, who carries a lot of the LGBTQ legislation in the State House. And, you know, the students were able to be a part of this from the get-go, which was really nice. We partnered with GLAAD, which is a LGBTQ public interest firm that handles New England. And so they were our main partner, and we created a coalition, the Connecticut Parentage Act. We called it the We Care Coalition, and it included a range of organizations and stakeholders in the state: LGBT organizations, children's rights organizations, healthcare providers, assisted reproduction groups, fertility access advocacy organizations, Planned Parenthood, the ACLU, and really wanted to make sure that we were building this from the ground up, and working with stakeholders to make sure we were able to show lawmakers in the state why this was really important, and also working with state actors to make sure we were getting buy-in and working with them. So we worked very closely with the probate court and the judicial branch, as well as with the state agencies who deal with these matters, like the Department of Social Services and the Department of Children and Families. And we were derailed by the pandemic in the 2020 session, but we came back in 2021 and were able to pass it. So the nicest thing was that some of the students who had started working on it in their first year of law school were able to see it passed in their third year of law school right before they graduated.
And that's an amazing accomplishment all around. It was interesting to hear you sort of itemize the different communities that came together, but it's really an ecosystem. So I'm wondering, have you had other experiences prior to this trying to have a law change or to change laws?
Yeah, so I've been very focused on parentage. So I have been involved with some of the other efforts in other states. Connecticut was kind of refreshing in that it was a bit more substantive than some of the experiences we've had in other jurisdictions. Mm-hmm. People were happy to get into the weeds, and we included people early on. I'm involved in some legislative work that's happening right now in Colorado, and it's a scramble because all the stakeholders weren't there at the get-go. And so I found in Connecticut, we were able to get everyone to the table early on and really be able to be thoughtful about how we were going to do this and make sure that there weren't folks coming out of the woodwork at the last minute saying, well, what about me? Or I haven't been consulted. We really were exhaustive. And the legislators here, I think, really appreciated that.
Okay, fantastic. As you were talking, you're really referencing culture change in addition to behavior change and mindset change. We live in polarized times. Changing laws on parents and children might seem like a culture war issue. I'm wondering if you could talk with us about how you actually managed to get large communities, large populations to come on board to support this particular law, and at the same time, because I heard you made a nice comparison to another example of where people weren't early adopters. So could you talk a little bit more about that process and roles that you had taken on, but also I imagine, this is a community building activity. What other activities occurred? Yeah,
so it was really fascinating, I think, for me, but also for my students who at the law school, we tend to be too focused on federal systems. We teach federal law primarily and focused on the Supreme Court and Congress and the executive branch. And this was about the state. And it was focused on getting state lawmakers in a heavily Democratic state, but still one with a significant Republican population, in the legislature to see this as an important issue. And I think we were all really heartened to see that people were not just dug into their positions, people were willing to listen and be educated. And many of the lawmakers had not thought about this issue, didn't know it was a problem, but they were willing to listen and be moved. And one example just sticks out in my mind. In our first hearing in the 2020 session, the ranking Republican member on the Senate side of the Judiciary Committee was there. We had had a meeting with him in which we told him what the bill was, but we otherwise hadn't had any other conversations with him. But one of the families testified, and they were in tears, and he was in tears. And he came over to us after the hearing and said, I signed on as a co-sponsor during that testimony. And so nothing's more powerful, I think, than hearing from families, but you have to be willing to listen. And the legislators were willing to listen. And then the 2021 session, there was a new House side ranking member on the Judiciary Committee, and he had founded the Conservative Caucus in the legislature. And we were genuinely concerned that it might be a obstacle for us. We had meetings with him. He was a lawyer. He understood the issues. And at the end, even if he wasn't necessarily, for a lot of people, the importance of the LGBT equality dimensions of this was huge. He cared a lot about making sure that children's lives were respected and that we were protecting their relationships. And he became a co-sponsor. And when the governor signed the bill on Pride Day in June of 2021, he was there to witness that. And so, I mean, it's naive of me to think that this has application in a lot of other settings, but it was nice to see that in our state, people are still willing to listen to each other. And we had Republican support from the get-go in both sessions. And that was actually really important for us to be able to move the bill forward and to have people understand the importance of something like this.
Yeah, and I really value storytelling. Kim, in her introductory remarks, talked about the Last Belonging Initiative, which really focused on telling your story. So thank you for sharing that. I'm wondering if there's another side to this equation, and that's the lens of either resistance or opposition. Did you experience any? And if so, how'd you work either around it or through it or conquer it?
Yeah, so the depressing thing to me was that the most resistance were from lawyers who don't like change and who don't. So the community of lawyers who practice in these cutting edge areas of assisted reproduction and LGBT family formation in the state, it's a very small group, and they were wonderful and helpful and supportive. But the general population of family lawyers took more time to get them to a place where they were comfortable with this. And I think for folks who are the ones that are, doing cases and having to, the bill is 177 pages long. So people quite reasonably don't like to have to get up to see, but it was important. And even with the courts were saying, we have to do new forms, and the Department of Public Health, we have to do new kinds of forms here and birth certificates. And we have this very important, what I take to be maybe the most important part of the bill. And that is we changed what were previously under our law called acknowledgements of paternity to acknowledgements of parentage. So under federal law, every state is required to have what they call a hospital-based system of paternity registration. And so that's the most common way that paternity is established for non-marital children in the US. Mm-hmm. And so if you go to Yale, New Haven, I think something like 40 to 50% of the births there are to unmarried women, and something like 70% of those cases are being paternity is being established through signing the acknowledgement of paternity. The birth parent and the man who says he's the biological father sign it together. It has the force of a judgment, and so it establishes paternity and has legal effect. And what we did was change it to an acknowledgement of parentage and keep the same folks can sign it, but also open it to same-sex couples and others using assisted reproduction, that they could sign it to say they're an intended parent. And we're now the 10th state to do that. And the Department of Public Health wasn't thrilled about this because they have forms and computer systems. And so really, it took getting people to see we're going to do this. And so come along with us so that we can make it as painless as possible. But it's going to happen, and it's important that it happens. And concerns about changing forms or learning new law are not sufficient reasons to not do this. So that was where we had to deal with the most resistance.
Yeah. So let me move from resistance to the word fear. Were there any conversations that you were a part of or learned about where part of the resistance may have been someone's personal fear, or in other cases, maybe lack of knowledge about this particular community and the goals of this project?
Yeah, so what was interesting in Connect, so I think in other states, the fact that it protects LGBTQ families would be a problem. And there might be reasons not to promote parentage reform in that way. Mm-hmm. In Connecticut, our legislators and lots of people in the state were actually eager. They got it when we talked about those families. Yeah, my friend or my neighbor, had to do that, and they shouldn't have to do that. Mm-hmm. But once you start digging into it, so for instance, we have a provision in there that allows a court to recognize more than two parents for a child. And that made some people uneasy. And I think it is fear. And people started to say, well, what if, a heterosexual identified man says, what if my wife divorces me, gets married to another man, and he says he's a parent? And you have to sort of educate folks on who these families are. In my own research, I study some multi-parent families, and courts actually are only doing this when the person really is the parent of the child. And it's not being used by step parents to assert parentage. And so I think people get worried when they think that things are changing, but what they sometimes fail to see is things have already changed. We just haven't really caught up to it. And so these families all exist. People might not think of them. And sometimes they're the most vulnerable families. The reason there's a third parent is often that the biological parents were facing challenges that made it difficult to parent. And so it's about protecting the children in these families. And I think having people come back to that and see that these families exist, that's why the family stories are so important, helps deal with some of the fear, which is just fear of the unknown and fear of unintended consequences.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I love the power of the storytelling. You talked about different partners. I'm wondering if we could focus a little bit on your law students.
Yeah.
You had partners in this work. You led a clinic. You referenced your law students. Could you share with me and us what the role of the clinic was, and specifically the role that your law students played?
Yeah. So I should start by saying I'm not a clinician, but Dean Gerken sort of set an example at the law school of those of us on the doctrinal side being able to do clinics when it intersects with work we're doing. And I, was a practicing lawyer before becoming an academic, and got licensed in Connecticut to make sure I could do this work. And so I started a legislative advocacy clinic on this, and had students working on it across the 3 years we were doing it, including the 2 sessions in which it was introduced. Some of those students carried over, so we had institutional memory and they were able to lead teams in the last year. The really wonderful thing is that at the law school, I had students who before coming to law school, their job was in public interest marketing and consulting or communications. And so we were able to really have students with skill sets. I'm not on social media at all. So students who could run the social media accounts, students who could figure out how to do certain kinds of communication strategies and press releases and get op-eds placed. And so that was wonderful. And then we had students doing more traditional legal work. We needed to research things. We needed to go through the Connecticut statutes and amend all of the statutes that are affected, because there's a bunch of statutes that use terms like paternity and limit. So think of probate statutes. We want to make sure that if someone dies, that all of the children we're having recognized are going to be treated as legitimate children of the decedent. And so we had to really do all of that. And students were tremendously helpful. And they also did a lot of legislative advocacy. So they helped with testimony. They met with constituents and really drove letter writing. And so they were able to see every dimension of it and, I hope, really be able to do the work that they were most passionate about and get an experience that they otherwise weren't going to get, since most of the other work they were exposed to was really litigation type work. And this was something different. But they were wonderful, and it was made it so meaningful to be able to get across the finish line with them.
And it sounds like an amazing learning experience that you don't often get a chance to replicate from year to year.
Yes.
So it sounds very exciting.
Yes.
So Doug, I started by saying I've got sort of 5 categories of questions. I'm going to switch us to my 4th category, which is about the law and your scholarship. You don't need to be a lawyer to know that there's been a lot of change in the law, especially in the last 10 years, with regard to protections for our lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer community. There seems to be more and more protections. But I know in Florida, which I recently visited this year, and elsewhere, there's current attention to LGBTQ issues, specifically in schools and in classrooms. Can you say a bit about the LGBTQ community and the law and its impact and some of the decisions that some of our politicians are making?
Yeah.
I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, so unfortunately, I mean, as you probably would guess, parentage law in Florida is also really dreadful for LGBTQ people. And parentage law in Texas is not good for LGBTQ people. So there are zones like New England where, there's really equality across multiple domains: employment, parent-child relationships, schools. And then you get to other very populous states like Florida and Texas, in which right now in Florida or Texas, if an unmarried lesbian couple has a child together and breaks up, only the biological mother is a legal parent. And in Texas, the courts were even saying until recently that a married lesbian couple who had a child together couldn't both be parents of that child, even though we don't require that men married to women be a biological father. So these are states where I think LGBTQ people and their families are already feeling stigmatized and facing discrimination. The schools bills in Florida, for instance, are bad for children and bad for parents. There are, whether the law recognizes them or not, there are families that include LGBTQ parents in Florida, and their kids are in school. And we have the luxury in Connecticut of being able to talk to our schools about making sure that their curriculum is inclusive and reflects the lives of the children in the classroom. And now in Florida, people don't have that luxury. And those children are going to get messages that their families don't measure up. And that's what we've been fighting against for so long. I mean, in Texas, and it's even more horrifying given the Child Protective Services order, that parents who are allowing their children to have gender affirming care are essentially deemed to be committing child abuse or neglect. And I mean, in some ways, it goes so much against conservative ideas about parental rights and parental autonomy. It's parental rights and autonomy for some people and not for others. And it's obviously not good for children to be in situations where not only is their emergent identity being stigmatized, but their parents are being told they can't. The thing I said is so important to parentage, making decisions for your child about healthcare, they can't make those decisions and protect their children. So, I mean, I'm sort of in despair about some of this stuff, but I also know we have people who are working on it, including folks at Yale and at the Yale Child Study Center, who are trying to get people to understand the stakes and see that this is bad for families and bad for children.
Yeah. Doug, you used the word luxury when you were responding to the last question. I have a note here where early on you referenced making New England a zone of equality. I'm a native of New Haven, which makes me a native of Connecticut and still a resident. And I have to say, listening to you talk and the outcome of the collective effort makes me proud to not just say I'm a resident of New Haven, but certainly of Connecticut. And so, I'm thinking about your work through the lens of both scholarship, but also through a legal lens, and then also, the sort of teaching and exposure that you've created for your students. So scholarship can sometimes be highly theoretical, dealing with the ideas rather than the practical matters. That might be different at a law school, maybe, I guess. How do you see the relationship between scholarship and the changes in law? Is there one? And if so, what's your view?
Yeah. So some of my colleagues at the law school would certainly say I'm not sufficiently theoretical. So I will just start with that. I care deeply about having effects in the world. And that's why I think a law school is actually a really good setting for some of the things that I was most interested in. I mean, my research is motivated by my commitments to certain values and certain communities. And so I found myself really focusing on parent-child relationships when I understood the harms. And so for me, it's not abstract or theoretical. And so I was interested in being able to show people how the parentage framework works to marginalize some people and benefit others. I think one could have a fairly simplistic view that just says, well, non-biological parents, because biology is what mattered. If you're not a biological parent, you're all treated the same, you have to adopt. But what I tried to do in my work is really dig down into the frameworks of each state, because this is a state-by-state question, and see that that's not really true. If you're a man married to a woman, biology isn't everything. And so it's some people who are being told they have to adopt their own children. And also, biology has been deemed more essential to women, to motherhood, than to men or fatherhood. And so it carries forward ideas we've had that it's sort of women's natural destiny to be mothers, and fathers can be replaced by someone else. And you see that even in the way the law has developed. And so it was much easier in some states to get recognition for non-biological mothers in same-sex couples because courts essentially treated them like fathers. They satisfied paternity presumptions. But non-biological fathers in male same-sex couples have had a much harder time. And actually their hard time has been like the experience of non-biological mothers in different sex couples, because our law has had a hard time saying that a woman who doesn't give birth is a parent. And so I've been motivated by trying to get people to see that the burdens of the system don't fall evenly. The other thing is that this work, it sort of is a feedback loop for me. So doing this work, the place that we encountered the most resistance was on what I called functional parenthood. And that is someone's a parent because they have formed a parent-child relationship. We have requirements. They have to reside with the child, hold the child out as their child. But they formed a parent-child relationship. They might have come into the child's life when the child was 1. They weren't there when the child was born, but this is the child's parent. And a lot of people resisted that because they thought, well, then anyone's going to be a parent. And biological parents are going to have their rights infringed by these folks who are really just mere helpers who are coming in. And it just didn't reflect what I knew to be the families who are affected by this. And so a colleague of mine, Courtney Jocelyn at UC Davis, who does this work as well, we decided to collect all of the functional parent cases in the 29 jurisdictions that have these doctrines, and with a fabulous team of research assistants at Yale, code them and be able to see what are the cases. And then now we're taking that research. So in Massachusetts, the big resistance is to the functional parent provision. And the advocates at GLAAD are sending the draft article, and I'm in meetings telling them. So for instance, in 83% of these 600 plus cases we have, the person who's saying they're a functional parent is the child's primary caregiver, right? It's like a lot of families facing a lot of challenges. In 20% of the cases, no legal parent has been a consistent presence in the child's life. So it's not what people envision. It's not the step parent who's saying, I want to be a parent too. It's actually families, you get more of these cases in places like Kentucky and West Virginia that sociologists are showing us because of the opioid epidemic, a lot of children are not residing with a legal parent. And so someone else is parenting them. And I guess the bigger push, the sense where I do get more theoretical is I want people to see that as parenting. Like that is not just caregiving.
Right.
The parenting is a practice. It's not a status.
And it's an investment as well.
Yes. It's hard work.
Yes, I have 2 children and I agree with that. Doug, so one might look at this accomplishment and say you're all done. I'm not sure you are. So my next question is really about, maybe it was about yesterday, but I think it's written as if we're looking into the future. What's next? And more importantly, what's next for you? What else are you working on?
Yeah, so I think, in some ways, the most basic thing is getting more states to treat people equally, and also getting other states to respect what we're doing in places like Connecticut. I just had a call yesterday with lawyers who say, I can get a Connecticut judgment. And then I go to Alabama and the Alabama Department of Vital Records says, I don't have to treat this, or Tennessee, the case we were talking about was Tennessee. I don't have to treat this as a valid judgment. I'm not giving you a birth certificate. And so we need to really focus on those questions of people being able to go across state lines to hostile territory and be treated as parents. That's a big concern for people. It's why people still adopt even when they live in friendly states, even though the adoption decree should not be treated differently than a judgment or anything else that has a court order. So that's one thing. The things that follow from passing parentage reform. So for instance, there have been folks in Connecticut interested in changing definitions of infertility so that same-sex couples and single women would have access to covered infertility treatment. And I think you'll see that continue to take off. So assisted reproduction has become a big focus. And so there's also something we did in our law, but it's just a start, is how are we going to regulate that industry? And how are we going to provide information to people who have donor conceived? So making sure they get their medical history, that they have full information. So I think that's really a next frontier. And I think that's a tricky one because I'm committed to things like people should have access to medical information. And I'm also even committed to things like people should be counseled about the importance of telling their children that they were donor conceived, about thinking about whether they want a donor who agrees to have their identity released when the child is 18. But I also think some of those discussions tend to geneticize family relationships in ways that are problematic for my own work and LGBTQ families. And so I think we need to be clear that when we talk about relationships created through donor gametes, those are relationships that could have different meanings, but we shouldn't talk about them as biological fathers, parents. I think it's important, and we shouldn't be thinking that children are harmed by not having both biological parents raising them. And so for me, I think an important next sort of bigger project is just to get people to see that biology doesn't make parent-child relationships. And in our current world of 23andMe, where we're really fetishizing ancestry and genetics, it's important to be able to get people to appreciate that that's not all that family is.
Yeah, thank you. So for our audience, please feel free to type questions in. I have just a couple more questions, so trying to bring us a little bit closer to closure. This is sort of my fifth and final category, and I've sort of titled it Advice and Guidance. Kind of a two-part. So what should we all know about parents and children in Connecticut? First part. And then the second is, what should we tell our friends? So I'm thinking specifically, as you started to describe that ecosystem, what role can I play? What role can other members that are either going to watch this recorded discussion or are with us today, what actions can we take away from today's discussion?
Yeah, so I mean, I hope people appreciate that what a lot of folks take for granted, other people spend a lot of time and energy and money making clear. And so I know people still think, well, if, and the one legislator who voted against us, he said on the House floor, well, can't gay people just adopt? And that was the remedy for him. And I will say in most, like in European countries, increasingly I always say they talk about adoption as the remedy. And here we talk about it as the harm, because you shouldn't have to, I'm an adoptive parent, but I didn't have to adopt my own child. I adopted in the process in which someone else is the parent at birth. But the folks that we're helping here, they're adopting their own kids. No one else is saying they're a parent of that child. And so I think people need to experience and appreciate that is not something parents should have to go through. And so when we see that, I think it starts to get us to see that, our social understandings of parenthood probably should match our legal understandings. Because if you go to communities around our state, people are treating that non-biological mother in the same-sex couple like a parent. The healthcare providers, the school, the extended family, the friends, the neighbors, it's just the state that hasn't been treating her that way. And so our law should match. In family law especially, I think it's important, we talk about the difference between sort of formal family law regimes and functional family law regimes. And I'm on the functional side. I think our family law systems should reflect the way people live their lives, rather than trying to channel people into particular forms of family and relationship by punishing people who don't conform. And that's, I think less conformity around family arrangements is not a bad thing, and we should meet people where they are.
Where they are. Thank you, Doug.
Yeah.
Thank you. So Doug, I can read one of the, I see one question in the chat, and it's personal. So the person said, this is a personal question for Doug. And the question reads, how do you organize your time and keep energy for your scholarship and life outside of work with this advocacy? Any tips on how you do that well?
I'm just exhausted all the time, I think. So I have a 3-year-old. So that certainly takes a lot of time. I fortunately have the luxury of being at a law school where at least my dean really supported this work and appreciated it. And so if I was a little less productive in my scholarly writing, I didn't feel like I was sort of shirking. But I will also say it was an intense couple years where, as any time I had, I was spending on this legislation. And so I fortunately was able to integrate it into my teaching. And so when I say I taught a clinic, I also got credit for teaching a clinic. And so there were 2 semesters where that was my course load, teaching the clinic. So it really allowed me to focus on that work. The other thing is, I think the synergy between the legislative advocacy and my scholarship is helpful. And so I was writing about things that I was learning and getting interested in, and questions were being framed by doing that legislative work. And so for me, I was fortunate to have, and so now it spawned this sort of series of projects with my co-author, because we've gotten so invested in this. But yeah, I was really happy when it passed, both because it helped so many people in the state, but also because it meant I could finally take the research leave that I'd been delaying because I was working on this all the time. So it's not easy.
Fantastic. I see another question has popped in. It says, you mentioned one of the testimonies from the legislative process. Can you share some other stories?
Yeah, so meaning stories that people told to lawmakers?
That's my assumption.
Yeah, so actually we had one of the most amazing stories was from a Yale Law School student who was in my clinic. And she was born through one of the first surrogacy arrangements in the US involving a male same-sex couple. Her fathers lived in California. They then moved to New Mexico, where she was raised. And she's been involved with an advocacy organization called Collage, which represents children of LGBTQ parents. And she both got Collage on board to support our bill, and now I've been working with them, and they're involved in the Massachusetts effort as well. But she also testified, and she testified about what it was like to grow up, because she's, a law student, and so things have changed dramatically, and not have her non-biological father be her legal parent, to have for a lot of her life the woman who was the surrogate be her legal mother on her birth certificate, and to also feel like people didn't treat her family as, fully belonging. I had a Republican legislator on the committee call my cell phone after that and said, I don't know if you saw this testimony, but it was the most amazing thing I've ever seen. And I could tell, he said, by her testimony, that her fathers did an incredible job raising her. And then when we got to the Senate floor, which was our last hurdle before the governor's signature, our lead Senate sponsor gave a speech in which she talked about this student's testimony and about her family. And it was just, it was so great, because so much of the law school experience at Yale is about being analytical and making arguments in law that persuade decision makers. And she can do that, but she also knew how to make an argument that was persuasive for emotional reasons and for personal reasons. And it also, she started crying during her testimony, and she talked to me afterwards and said, I didn't expect that. I didn't think I was going to be so moved, but telling this group of lawmakers about my experience was just more moving than I imagined it to be. And so it was things like that that really, I think that really stuck with me. The other thing I'll just say is there was testimony by someone from the family law section of the Connecticut bar in the first session that we were in. And what she missed was that right before her was this family I talked about with the de facto mother who had been raising the kid since he was 3 and now he was 14. And that had everyone in tears. But this woman from the bar wasn't there for that. And so she just waltzed in when they called her and gave this testimony about how bad de facto parentage was, because suddenly anyone was going to be a parent. You could have 100 parents, and these people aren't really parents. And the legislators just tore into her and started saying, like, you mean to tell me this? And then finally, the co-chair of Judiciary, the Senate side, said, because she then kept saying step parents are going to be parents. And he said, I'm a stepfather, and I'm the only father my children know. And you have to stop saying that all step parents are not parents, So it really was just like, one, know your audience and see what comes before you. But two, like, it just showed how people's actual experiences can rebut some of these arguments that are just about assumptions from people who don't really know what people's family lives are like.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love in that story, the change in role, which the I perspective that you were describing, right?
Yeah.
So automatically it became personal.
Yes.
I do think when things become personal, I think that's when we can make even more progress.
Yeah.
So Doug, I am trying to keep my eye on the Q&A. And we have another question. There was a comment where someone said, thank you so very much for today's talk. So I will extend that gratitude to you. The next question says, how intersectional are issues about parentage? Do you run into questions of racism and other forms of discrimination?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So certainly I think what people fail to realize is that if you look at family demographics, marital families and non-marital families look different. So we are in a world in the US of marriage decline. Rates of marriage used to be high. They've gotten lower and lower. Rates of marriage used to be similar across racial and ethnic groups, but they now diverge significantly. So African Americans and Latinos are less likely to be married than whites and Asian Americans. It's also stratified by class. people with higher incomes and more education are more likely to be married. And so for us, a big part of this was protecting parents and children in non-marital families. And so I think that does have race and class dimensions. And I think so that was important to get people to see that, look, you might think that we're just sorting people based on, are you a biological parent? Are you a marital parent? But that actually has a disparate impact based on race and class. There's also intersections with immigration. And so we did, one of the members of our coalition was an immigration organization, because I'm sure you remember early on in our efforts, the Trump administration was separating children at the border. And the federal government decided they were going to use DNA tests to determine whether people were actually parents of the child. Well, to me, that's not determining whether someone's actually a parent of the child. And in fact, they weren't even asking whether the home jurisdiction would treat them as a parent. It was just sort of, we decided this is what a parent-child relationship is. And surprise, some of those people were not genetic parents, but they were the primary caregivers of those children. And so people saw the importance of more expansive understandings of family relationships in the immigration setting as well.
Doug, the last comment that I see is just that. It is another note of gratitude. It says, thank you for this session. I'm amazed at what I didn't know, and you have shed some light around unanswered questions that I had.
Great.
And so I'm going to take us to a close. And first, I'm going to practice gratitude as well. And I want to say thank you. My thank yous are probably a little bit different. Mine is sort of a selfish thank you, because at the beginning you said you moved to Connecticut. So let me say very selfishly, I'm so glad that you live in Connecticut and that we are working towards creating a region where there is equality. But when I start to think about the state that I'm living in, it's really nice to know that we're making positive movement towards creating a world of inclusion. So I'm selfishly saying thank you, and hope you stay in Connecticut for quite some time.
I will.
And continue to transform our state and us as people. You used the word "we decided," and so I'm going to switch that to "I decided." I decided that I'm going to close out by saying you rock. And thank you so much for all of your time today. But I think the thank you also needs to be extended to the team of individuals that you've constantly itemized as you were answering questions that are part of that village that is helping to make change in Connecticut and also in other states where change is certainly necessary.
Yes.
I just want to close with one question, and mine is sort of around hopefulness. As you think about the progress that's been made within our state, and then you look outside of Connecticut, US and beyond, are you hopeful that in maybe this lifetime, your lifetime or your child's lifetime, that we as a society will become much more inclusive and practice more equity?
Yeah. So I want to leave on. I mean, things are really depressing right now. And I was just, I'm a co-author on a case book on sexuality and gender identity and the law, and we're doing a new edition. And my co-author was saying, like, if you went back to 10 years ago, and actually the author who started the book in the early 90s said, no idea that these issues I wrote about then were going to be the main issues now. It was anti-gay curriculum laws, just so that leaves me with a lot of worry. But I also think that the experience here has shown that people who are willing to listen can be moved, and that people care about their neighbors and family members, and more people are going to be living in family arrangements that don't look like their parents' family arrangements. And I'm an example of having parents who come around to understanding the importance of respecting people, even if they don't conform to what your life looked like. And so I do have some optimism around that. And, that seeing the kids in Florida and Texas push back also gives me optimism.
Yeah, I agree. And our advocates are becoming younger and younger and younger, which I think is fantastic. And using their voice, not finding it, but using their voice. So I'm going to close out again by saying thank you very much, and thank you to all of the attendees for today's webinar. Brief reminder that Belonging at Yale website has a calendar of upcoming events on topics that enhance diversity, support equity, and promote a welcoming environment and inclusive environment here at Yale. Thank you, Doug, for spending your afternoon and almost a little bit of your evening with us. And everyone else, thank you so much, and have a great evening and a great weekend. Take care.
Thank you.